Okay, let me wish you all, first of all, a very good morning. Welcome all of you to UNICEF House. I'm glad you found your way down to the basement. We call this the dungeon, but we're not going to incarcerate you here all day. As you know, there will be sessions, small group meetings, and other parts of UNICEF House today. It's my job just to wish you a very warm welcome. I think today is going to be a very exciting day as we think through some of the issues that need to be addressed in making evaluation a real part of the 2030 agenda. We all know that the MDGs were not evaluated as fully and as thoroughly as perhaps might have been useful. And we hope that in beginning to set the course for evaluation as we go towards 2030, that we'll be able to make a bigger contribution as evaluators. And I know many of you in the room are not evaluators, so as commissioners of evaluation and as users of evaluation evidence. Let me say, first of all, that I should have introduced myself, I guess. I'm Colin Kirk. I'm the Director of Evaluation here in UNICEF. I'm wearing several hats today. I'm also one of the vice chairs of the UN Evaluation Group, which has been very active in trying to make sure that across the UN there's a harmonized approach to evaluation activities. And I'm proud to say I'm also the co-chair of EvalPartners, which is this very broad alliance of different evaluation associations, agencies, various evaluation entities of different kinds. And many of you here in the room today are active participants in the EvalPartners network. So a very warm welcome to all of you, and a big note of appreciation, I think, right from the outset for all the hard work that has brought you all together here today. I would like to kick off today's events with a little ceremony, I would like, first of all, to invite Marco Segone as the former EvalPartners co-chair and as the current chair of the UN Evaluation Group to join me here on the platform. I'd like to invite my current EvalPartners co-chair, Ziad Musa, who I did see, there he is. Ziad, come and join us. I would also like to invite two of our distinguished parliamentarians to join us. So the Honourable Minister Kabir Hashim is with us today. And last and far from least, I would like to invite the Honourable Pokaran to come and join us from Nepal. So please come and join us, sir. As many of you know, but some may not know, Nepal saw the Global EvalPartners Forum in November. It was an evaluation week held in Kathmandu, and I think the highlight was a meeting in the Nepalese Parliament, hosted by the Speaker of the Nepalese Parliament. And all that happened, I'm sure, thanks to the hard work of the Honourable Pokaran. So thank you for joining us today, sir. Let me pass the mic now to the chair of the Parliamentarians group with with EvalPartners, the Honourable Kabir Hashim. Kabir.
Thank you. I think why we are standing here in front of you today is that in the last few years, a group of parliamentarians have engaged in evaluation aggressively, and we've been able to do lots of things people thought was impossible. We've had parliamentarians attending workshops and conferences. We've gone to many extents, and the highlight was that we celebrated Eval Year last year in Nepal, in Kathmandu, right in the heart of the Parliament of Nepal. And I think it is only right for us to honor Honorable Ananda Pokaral, who was a member, who was an opposition member of Parliament when we really started it all, and then suddenly he was in the riding seat being the minister and he got us the complete support of the Nepali Parliament to back us. And this event was held in Parliament very successfully. So I would ask Marco at this point to just say a few words, and then we decided that today we have to remember that event, and we have to give him a memento, and I would ask Marco to say something before he does that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. No, just very briefly to say, really to officially acknowledge the wonderful leadership of Minister Pocarel for making a dream become a reality. As already mentioned yesterday, it was the first time ever that we had a global evaluation event inside the national parliament. And I was really impressed to see that the Speaker of the Parliament stayed with us during the entire session of the Parliament. We had up to 100 parliamentarians. The Prime Minister came three times at the EvalPartner Forum. So that was made possible only thanks to the great leadership of Minister Pocarel. So I think that today we are here really to officially appreciate this leadership, and I'm sure that your leadership will be of inspiration to many other countries.
We can now move to the first business of today. So let me invite the panel participants to come and join us, come and join me, I should say, on the podium. Good. Well, it's my pleasure then to turn to the agenda, and we have several very distinguished keynote speakers. So let me, without further ado, turn to Marco Sigone as our first keynote speaker. Marco is, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the current chair of the UN Evaluation Group, UNEG, and has done, I think, more than anybody else to really help to pull EvalPartners together, but of course relying on the inputs from all of us. Marco was formerly a colleague in the evaluation office in UNICEF, but is now the director of evaluation in UN Women. So Marco, it's a pleasure to welcome you back to UNICEF, and please continue.
Good morning, everybody. It's really a big pleasure to see you again. I hope that you appreciated yesterday's session. And I hope you will forgive me, but as any good Italian, I like moving and dancing while I'm talking. So I hope it's okay with you. Yesterday we talked about SDGs, but before talking about SDGs, I would like to talk about the work that we have today and to see how it compared with the work that we would like to achieve through the SDGs. The world that we have today is a world of massive concentration of wealth. The richest 1% of the population owns 40% of the world wealth, while the poorest 50% of the population owns only 1% of the world wealth. You may say, well, okay, that's only about income poverty. But if we go also to human development, unfortunately, the situation is not very, very different. Almost 1 billion people are still malnourished. And look also at the next one. 1 in 3 women will be beaten, raped, abused, or mutilated in their lifetimes. And just as a reminder, these indicators are not referring to the Middle Age. These are indicators from last year. They look like the Middle Age, but unfortunately they are not. So is this the world that we want? Because that's the world where we live in now, today. Or do we want a world where all rights for all human beings everywhere at any time are achieved? But how to do that? By prioritizing the most deprived. And that's why the principle of no one left behind is so central to the SDGs. Because we should avoid to be in that situation of that man over there saying, you know, for a first election, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that trees. Without taking in consideration that different populational groups are in different situations. So if we want everybody to enjoy the same rights, and in the case of the picture that you have in the screen, you know, if we want both the short guys and the tall guys to enjoy the match, we have to take into consideration that they are in different situations, and therefore they need different treatment. And that means that, you know, if we have 3 boxes as resources, we should not distribute them evenly, but we should distribute them in a way that we are prioritizing the short guys so that everybody can enjoy the match. With the world that we have today, we may feel like this lady over there, but in reality, we should feel like this. Because, as I mentioned yesterday, the SDGs are our biggest opportunity to really transform our world. I will go through it very quickly, the 5 reasons why they are our biggest opportunity. First of all, because they have been developed through the inclusive and participatory process, and therefore it's much more likely that they are owned by every country. Second, because they are universal, so for all countries. Third, because they are comprehensive and integrated. And, well, I'm not sure we have a connection to internet, but you know, I think this PowerPoint will be distributed. So when you get it, just click on that hyperlinks, because mainly it gives you the idea of how comprehensive the SDGs are. So those are the goals, the 17 goals, and then the targets. And you will see, if you click in the hyperlink, you will see that they are very much interconnected. So if something changes in one target or SDGs, everything changes, just because they are really very much interconnected. The fourth reason is because the no one left behind principle is very much not present not only in the 2 SDG 5 and SDG 10, but also they are mainstream in all the SDGs. And the 5th one is, as I mentioned yesterday, that there is this follow-up and review mechanism that was not exactly the case with MDGs. And so all the 192 heads of state, they committed to have this robust, effective, inclusive, and transparent follow-up and review framework. So what are the challenges for the evaluation community? The challenges and the opportunities, taking in consideration this aspect. So the no one left behind is really the biggest opportunity, but also it poses also challenges for the evaluation community. Because we have to come together to try to answer some of these questions. So how to evaluate equitable development interventions? What are the evaluation questions to assess interventions are relevant and are having an impact in decreasing the inequity and inequality and in achieving results for the worst off groups? Yesterday we spoke a lot about the political will and the political leadership, because so the question is not only about what are the methodological challenges, but also what are the political, social, and financial implications in designing and managing equity-focused and gender-responsive evaluations. And perhaps even more importantly, as we said, countries should be in the driving seat. So how to strengthen the capacities of government, civil society, parliamentarians to evaluate, to demand and use and evaluate the effect of intervention on equitable outcomes for marginalized populations. So one of the good news is that different UN agencies came together with the so-called approach to equity-focused and gender-responsive evaluations. So there are already manuals existing. Some of them are available just outside of this room, where you can get some of the technical answer. So these are two manuals produced by UNICEF. This one is the Integrating Human Rights and Gender Equality in Evaluation. It's produced by the UN Evaluation Group. This is the Gender Responsive Evaluation Magazine, produced by UN Women, plus other manuals, etc. So that's just to say that there is already a lot of material existing, and it's all free of charge and available in internet. Now, another big opportunity is that there is a stronger and stronger demand for evaluation of no one left behind. So as we already mentioned, we got even the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon celebrating the International Year of Evaluation, and that culminated in the Parliament of Nepal in November. So we have this request for this awareness of evaluations that are relevant to no one left behind is very much now in the discourse, not only of evaluators, but also of parliamentarians and policymakers. The second thing that we have to take into account is that complexity will be the new normal. And that's obviously has important implication for the evaluation community. Will the traditional log frame, result frameworks, hierarchical results frames be still the approach that we should use, or do we need new approaches and new methodologies to be sure that we will be able to evaluate the complexities of the SDGs? And actually, this is one of the theme of this technical workshop, because we know that is one of the challenges. All these challenges are also pushing the global evaluation community to professionalize the evaluation function. So we have the European Evaluation Society, the Canadian, the UK, the Japanese, and the IDEAS, the international one, that are working on the professionalization of evaluation. EvalPartners and the 2020 EvalAgenda also have the professionalization of evaluation as one key element. And also within the United Nations, there are several agencies that are working on this area. The fourth big opportunity is a rebalance of leadership in the global evaluation community. In the past, the best national evaluation systems were in the global north. The majority of evaluation associations were in the global north, and mainly the demand for evaluation was in the global north. Today, the situation has changed dramatically. Today, there are several excellent national evaluation systems in the global south, and you can see there just a few of them mentioned. The majority of the existing 150 plus evaluation associations are in the global south. And very interestingly, the existing regional parliamentarian forum for evaluations are in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America, but not in West Europe and not in North America. So the global south now is leading, and the global north has to catch up somehow. The fifth big important trend is a more and more diverse multi-stakeholders community. So EvalPartner is one example. But this event was organized by purpose as a side event of the CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, because we realized that we should and we must reach out also women organizations that maybe they are not today very much involved with evaluation, But that's exactly the gap that we should bridge. We already are working with parliamentarians, but more and more we should also work with all the entire community of impact investment that, for your information, in terms of investment, financial investments, is much bigger, much bigger than the aid development community. And then not only working with national government, but also with local government. So there are already important, very good examples, and there are just two among many, the São Paulo state and the Johannesburg municipality, that they are already working on setting up monitoring evaluation system so that they will be able really to track their achievement towards the result. So that's why EvalGender was created. Here you just have some of the members of EvalGender, as you see, is mainly, as of today, mainly is about evaluation associations and UN agencies and multilateral banks. But here I would like to make a call for those of you who are here and are from women organizations. Please approach EvalGender. And we also have a community of practice with already more than 2,000 members that is managed by ISST, by Ritu, sitting in India. I hope she's over there. Ritu, can you just a second stand up? So if you are interested, just talk to Ritu. She will tell you how to join both the community of practice on gender responsive evaluation as well as EvalGender. And just to finish, to let you know that this event today is not just a standalone event, but is a milestone in a 2-year process. We started in January this year with a global online consultation discussing the same question that we will discuss today. And here we have some representatives who facilitated this online consultation, and they will inform you about the outcome of those discussions that happen online during the working groups. Today we have these technical events. The idea is to then produce a framework to evaluate SDGs with this No One Left Behind lens. And then there will be also the opportunity of delivering technical assistance to countries because, as we say, the country should be in the driving seat. So just to summarize, we have to come together because if we really want evaluation to be an agent of change for the world that we want to achieve, for the world that we want to transform, each of us should commit to that. And each of us should be the ambassador of this opportunity and challenge of evaluating the SDGs with this lens of no one left behind. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marco. I think Marco has very effectively set the scene for today and tomorrow's discussions. And I think he's also invited us not just to discuss, but to act. So let's keep that in mind as we go through today and tomorrow. It's my very great pleasure and privilege to introduce David Nabarro. Dr. Nabarro has been a health professional, I'm sure known to many of you, been an active health professional for many years, but in recent years has been a close advisor to the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, and has led the health campaigns around rollback malaria, and of course more recently he has helped to coordinate the response to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. Now he wears a new hat, which is to essentially champion Agenda 2030. And I don't want to say more than that because David Nabarro will tell us what his role is, I'm sure, in a few moments. So a very warm welcome to you, David. Thank you for joining us.
So, first of all, just to say to all of you how wonderful it is to be here. This is a really good room, in my view. It always feels good coming here. Always good stuff happens in this room. And so I'm delighted to be sitting here and with you on this very interesting and important occasion. Ananda Prasad Prokaralai, Namaste Bondino Pario, Spagat Hamro Garma. It's very nice to see you here, and delighted that a Nepali parliamentarian is taking such a powerful role in this endeavour. Also would like to greet Alfa Sharif, Member of Parliament. I really do believe that with this parliamentarian involvement, so much can move forward, and it's a privilege to be sitting next to Maitri Wikram Singh, and looking forward very much to hearing you in a second. And to Marco Sigone, thank you for a really interesting scene setter. And anybody else, just hello to you if I don't identify you personally. Just great to be here. My job since January the 1st has been to work with Ban Ki-moon to try to ensure that we give all the support we can to the people and nations that came together last year and reached extraordinary agreements on the plan for the future of the world, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is linked to the COP21 climate agreement in Paris in December, and also to the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development, and an agreement that we don't always remember in Sendai in Japan on disaster risk reduction. These were quite surprising to many of us, that there was the level of political consensus around the plan for the future that we actually saw. There's no plan B, by the way. It's either this or really a very big mess. And so I think that recognition of the need for collective responsible action was there. And there will be many of you who say, how come the world leaders 1 year can agree to such amazing outcomes, and then the next year, in some parts of the world, seem to be unable to reach political agreement on how to handle a war or how to handle mass movements of people? The answer is that at least last year, the political leaders suspended some of their more local disputes and said, actually, we have a world that is our responsibility. We have 3 or 4 generations ahead that are our responsibility, and we've got to get it right. And it's 17 goals because it was negotiated. Nobody would have come up with 17 goals if they were a public relations expert. They'd say we've got to have 10 or 8, and they've got to look nice and be nicely worded. These are 17 goals with every word in the goals and in the targets negotiated over 3 years. Many of you were involved in that negotiation. It's important to remember that. And Marco suggested that there's quite an easy way to memorize it. It's a global framework for people, for planet, for prosperity, for peace, and for partnership. It is new. If we look inside our various organizations and structures, international, regional, and national, the people working on peace and security tend to work in one place. The people working on justice and rule of law tend to work in another place. The people who work on development and people's well-being work in another place. The government, civil society, business, and academia are labeled as different sectors. The style of governance and working is very much divided into vertical pipes because it's easier, because it fits with the way our brains have been taught to work, and because that has become, over the years, the style of working. And yet all of us, in our own lives or when we're working in communities, realize that it's just not like that. Everything is interconnected. Power and autonomy are key. Wealth and cash is the vital ingredient to make things happen. And if things are handled in a joined-up way, with the right energy, then transformation can occur. And we've seen it many, many times. But that's not how the world has been governed. It's not how governments have worked. And so with the new agenda, we have the opportunity to try to adjust our global and national and local institutional thinking to what life is really like. Now, as Marco said, it's not easy. But I want to give you 5 headings that I think will become more and more important with framing the agenda for the future. My headings will be different from yours, but I wanted to share them now to see whether they're useful to you. First, the new agenda is about human rights and social justice. It reflects a revised contract between the world's duty bearers and the world's rights holders. You may or may not agree with that, but I believe that for many that is an underlying reality. It is about rights and the exercise of rights and the realization of rights. And within that, there are groups of people who've traditionally been marginalized who become closer to the center. Young people and women. Number 2, linked to that, this agenda will not work unless it is completely feminized from top to bottom. It will not work unless the perspective, the feminist perspective, is fully there. That's more than 50-50. It means the whole agenda has to be seen through the eyes of women. Simply because for so many years, development and life has been portrayed through the eyes of men, and it's not been got right. So let's try to see whether working through the eyes of women will get it right. And I think most of us believe it will. Number 3, we have to go beyond averages. Leave no one behind is about looking under the average, looking right down to the bottom 20%, the bottom 10%, the bottom 5%, the people who are normally not considered, because that doesn't conveniently fit into our ways of thinking and action. Averages no more. It's under and inside the average. Number 4, the 2030 Agenda is a political manifesto for the world. It's not a technical manifesto. It's not an institutional manifesto. We have to adjust our ways of thinking technically to respond to the new politics, not vice versa. In the past, we've often portrayed the link between technical and political as the technical telling the politicians what to do. Now, the pendulum will switch. In a second, I'm going to say a word or two about that before I finish. But see it as a political manifesto, the political manifesto. And then lastly, the agenda is about empowerment. That unless there is power with the people who have the capacity to transform their destinies, this will not change. If the power always stays with a few, a greedy few, who, as Marco said, insist on creaming off resources that should be used for the common good, it won't happen. So there is not just a political manifesto here, but it's a manifesto that involves a struggle to stop the concentration of power and wealth with a few. And so within this, there is a set of big challenges. How do we, as a group of people who primarily are technicians, primarily because we're not all technicians, there are 2 already, I've noticed, politicians here, and there will be more, but how do we technicians manage to locate ourselves properly within this new political agenda? And the answer is what I call the evidence policy cycle. And that is the relationship between evidence and policy formation and the pressure for new evidence. It is potentially an extremely virtuous cycle. It starts with the way in which we frame issues. All of you as evaluators know that the real challenge in an evaluation is the starting question, the framing. And the new agenda will help us to develop new frames of reference. Secondly, it's of course about data, but actually data is far less important than the way in which information is presented and used. And so, as well as having the right data, it's having the right systems for analysis, the right manner of presentation, and then the expression of that within the political environment so that our MPs can use this to good effect. And then they can come back and ask for more. And that's where the cycle becomes virtuous. A couple of issues on the framing. Firstly, inclusive framing so that we see issues particularly through the eyes of the people who are likely to be left behind. The invisible people, the disabled people, sometimes with hidden disability, never forget that. And also the people who just don't tend to get shown on the television. In my particular area of concern right now, it's women refugees looking after their children, trying to struggle, and often having to pay incredibly heavy prices for that. I'd like us to be thinking very hard about people can be engaged in evaluation work as actors themselves rather than as passives, and then how to encourage disaggregated thinking everywhere so that evaluation doesn't always become a matter of averages. Lastly, about the United Nations. This political agenda applies to the United Nations just as it applies to governments, civil society, academics, and business. We collectively are needing to find different ways of framing issues, different ways of thinking, different ways of working, different ways of reporting, and frankly, different ways of working together. This group, UN-EVAL, is one of the most powerful cross-UN groups that we have. What you do in this workshop will have a big impact on how we do learn to work better together because of the very important link between evidence and policy that you are such a big part of. So thank you for the chance to speak at the beginning of your event, and I look very much forward to hearing the outcomes. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, David. Let's move on to our next panelist, and it's a very great pleasure for me personally to introduce Professor Maitri Wickramasinghe. I say it's a personal pleasure because I spent many years of my misspent youth in Sri Lanka, and so let me wish you a very warm Aiboan to UNICEF House. Professor Wickramasinghe is professor at the University of Kelaniya in Sri Lanka, professor of gender studies. And it's perhaps important to say that Sri Lanka has been one of the countries where there's a very strong evaluation association working on that link that Dr. Nabarro was talking about just a few moments ago of linking up civil society action, the thinking and action of evaluators, with the work of government and the work of parliamentarians. So without more ado, let me turn it over now to Professor Wickramasinghe. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that gracious, generous introduction. I think I need the lectern because I need something to lean on. Fellow members of the head table, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm delighted to be here at this UN technical session, which seeks to conceptualize and operationalize an equity-focused and gender-responsive framework to evaluate the current aspirations in development, the Sustainable Development Goals. I thank you for seeking my views on the subject. It is indeed a great privilege. My mandate during the next 15 to 20 minutes is to consider how to ensure that those who generally get left behind, and let's talk about those, vulnerable women, defenseless children, marginalized youth, the forgotten elderly, the differently abled, the socially disadvantaged, the economically deprived, the internally displaced, and the sexually ostracized, to name a few. In fact, how to make sure that these groups are included in the SDGs, in development processes, and in their evaluation. Having looked at this morning's very comprehensive program relating to the technicalities of evaluation, I have gone a little bit beyond my mandate and taken it upon myself to sound a somewhat different note in this session. I want to examine some of the fundamental, what I would call epistemological gaps, assumptions, and connotations with regard to equity focus and gender responsive frameworks, whether in policy or programming or evaluation, that could perhaps deter or detract from the realization of this very impressive yet highly ambitious set of goals and targets. To begin with, let us take the two concepts of equity and equality, used somewhat carelessly and even arbitrarily in development discussions and debates. You will agree with me that one of the main considerations in an equity approach is that of identifying and targeting the different needs of people that emanate from their sex, gender, political, economic, social, and cultural differences and inequities. And as Marco Segone pointed out earlier, equitable treatment is presumed to fulfill these differing needs, interests, and priorities, and lead to fairness in action and social justice in effect. Yet such targeting can often take the form of isolated and compartmentalized programs based on various dominant assumptions related to common group concerns. For instance, I would like to take as an example the spate of non-governmental self-empowerment programs targeting poor women-headed householders, especially in the 1980s and 1990s in Sri Lanka. These offered rural women microcredit and entrepreneurship training in traditional skills such as rearing goats and poultry, food processing, beauty culture, and so on the premise that women could expand their time, learn a skill, produce goods and services, sell them, and become economically empowered, yet without routing access to local markets and supply and distribution schemes, let alone the global value chain. With reference to SDGs and SDGI 1 and SDG 5 of ending poverty in all forms everywhere and economically empowering women, what we need to take away from the evaluation of these projects is that they did not actually integrate women-headed householders into the local economies on equal terms. Even more disturbingly, these women were not always seen as targets for mainstream development opportunities, such as agricultural extension schemes from which these householders were left out, despite owning farmland and being farmers. If then, in using an equity approach, we do not also take into account similarities and commonalities in people's needs, there is a possibility then that our intervention or evaluation may perpetuate inequality. So let's take a look at the equality approach. An equality approach is based on the assumption that people have common needs, interests, and priorities that should be treated equally in terms of equal rights, freedom, status, responsibilities, opportunities, access to resources and benefits, and control over them. Equality is understood to lead to an absence of discrimination. The following example is related to SDG 4 of ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and the promotion of lifelong learning opportunities for all. If I may take Sri Lanka as an example again, the 2014 statistics of the University Grants Commission reveal that women undergraduates constitute 62% of those admitted to universities, while conversely, men comprise only 38% of the total figure of 25,200. Fueling the argument that university student populations are fast becoming feminized, in other words, In fact, as you may all well be aware, that there is, when it comes to numbers at least, more than inequality. And here we can refer to this as a neoliberal phenomenon in higher education, common to 2 out of 3 countries globally, and I'm quoting the Yale Global Online here. However, such parity in figures is confined to participation. It is by no means reflected in higher education leadership, as in the case of Sri Lanka, which is minimal when it comes to women in student union leadership or in university governance, management, and academic headship. Nor has it brought about gender equitable university cultures. In fact, university subcultures harbor some of the most oppressive, patriarchal, and discriminatory norms and mores that completely deny the targets of SDG 5, the rights of women and girls to dress as they wish, to live devoid of sexual objectification and coercion, and to be free from sexual and gender-based violence. Therefore, subscribing to the equality approach alone is insufficient in development. If we don't take into account people's vulnerabilities, in this case arising from gender differences, we can, and if we don't take them into account, we can easily augment inequities. Now, the 2 instances cited reinforce the fact that the frames of equity or equality in development can no longer be seen as an either-or option. Even though it has been argued that the concept of substantive equality does cover some equity issues, I find that its theoretical foundation somewhat insubstantial, but I will not be going there this morning. It is imperative, therefore, that both the commonalities in people's needs, which can be convincingly portrayed and evaluated by statistics, even though the actual features of these commonalities may get left out, and the differences in needs, even though arguably these 2 can be numerically assessed, but they may definitely require further qualitative unpacking and nuancing. And at the end of the day, that both the commonalities and the differences are addressed simultaneously in development frameworks, in policy, programming, monitoring, and evaluation. Marco earlier talked about the norm of complexity in conceptualizing and evaluating the SDGs. And here you will note that I framed my examples of equity and equality in terms of women as a uniform collective, in terms of economic activity and the field of higher education, in terms of discrimination as generalized and fixed, and in terms of women's gender rights as coherent, dependent, and tangible. But if we are to be gender responsive, we need to acknowledge that women, like any other category, are by no means a homogeneous group. While we may, as policymakers, practitioners, and evaluators, choose to emphasize a collective or group identity, an individual may interpolate or subscribe to multiple intersecting identities, as pointed out by Kimberly Crenshaw, or have identities actually imposed on them based on social delineations, specific histories, and the operation of socialization, of ideologies, and structures of power. It is vital then that we acknowledge that identities are layered and intersecting, contextual and time-bound, and that they lead to substantially different life experiences, and that these will be a significant key in determining how an individual will respond to the challenges of inequality and inequity. Moreover, as David Namarro pointed out, life experiences cannot simply be sectorized and isolated into fields, sectors, and activities, as health or disaster or the environment or higher education or whatever it is. Rather, we must also contemplate inequality and inequity in cross-cutting and holistic ways, so that the multiple facets and layers of inequities and oppression that people undergo are accommodated in development and in evaluation frameworks. And here, I can cite the case of 16-year-old schoolboy Raj, now residing in the coastal town of Kalkuda in eastern Sri Lanka, as an example. Raj is oppressed due to poverty and his ethno-religious locations within a wider social context. He is scarred due to serial displacements as a result of the long-drawn ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka, as well as the 2004 Asian tsunami within an environmental context. He is also a target of sexual abuse from an uncle within a personal context. Raj's case spans a number of SDGs and provides evidence of how inequalities and inequities are often interlinked and multisectoral, depending on one's identity, contextual and layered, depending on the context and the environment, and can also be time-bound, depending on personal experience and situational crisis. On the one hand, there may also be other individuals who may experience degrees of vulnerability and oppressions, but who may simultaneously possess various capacities and skills, as conceptualized by Amartya Sen and also Mata Nasambom. In fact, they may even be empowered on occasion, depending on the context. Let me give you an instance of a woman who may have achieved her rights in securing land and employment, but may still be victimized by her family in terms of her right to choose a same-sex sexual partner. We need to be mindful then that empowerment can seemingly coexist with oppression. Now, I'm sure that we are all aware that the SDGs themselves do not explicitly acknowledge the relationship between sexuality, gender identity, and development, as argued by Elizabeth Mills. This is the very reason why development practitioners and evaluators have a greater responsibility to fill in the gaps vis-à-vis the SDGs, to proactively ensure that they do not leave behind populations on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity and expression. In conclusion, let me close by reiterating the following points. The overarching currents of globalization and the predominant ethic of neoliberalism command an adherence to methods and measurements for the universal equalization and standardization of development. I think David Nabarro also talked about how the SDGs were formulated based on a hard-won international consensus on what should be prioritized as aspirations during the next phase in global development. Yet, we must not forget that the development policy makers and planners and evaluators possess the autonomy to frame their works in ways that can concurrently explore and evaluate gender equities and equalities, understand that there are spectrums of hierarchies of gender and social inequalities and inequities, and that they are enmeshed and contextual, account for the fact that people have multidimensional and interdimensional identities and may be simultaneously disempowered and empowered depending on the context and time period, and devised integrated multidimensional frameworks to explore and evaluate the realization of these different dimensions of equity and equality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wickramasinghe. And I think very helpful to have both the very grounded examples from Sri Lanka as well as the conceptual elaboration and indeed the political challenges that these cases throw up. Thank you so much. Let me turn now to our last speaker of the morning, and it's a great pleasure to introduce the Honorable Olfa Sharif from Tunisia. Olfa is a member of Parliament and, as I understand it, also a member of the Finance Committee in Parliament. She's also an active evaluator. She's the representative from the Middle East and North Africa region to the Global Parliamentarians Forum that we heard about just a few minutes ago. And we appreciate Olfa joining us here today. She was also very active in the November meeting in Kathmandu, where the Global Parliamentarians Forum was first launched. So without more ado, let me turn now to the Honourable Olfa Sharif. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, honourable speakers, honourable guests. It's a great pleasure today to be here with you to discuss how to ensure the SDGs will be evaluated with the focus of no one left behind, no woman left behind, no youth left behind. It means that women and men, girls and boys, have to be taken on board with 17 goals, very ambitious missions. As said a Brazilian poet, I have just 2 hands, but the sentiment of the world and humanity. Sustainable development goals are shaped global, universal, human, transversal, achieving one goal and reaching several others. The future of SDGs depends on what we define, but more important, how to evaluate it. A strong follow-up review mechanism will enable to evaluate and demonstrate, to give proof. There is a lot of purposes to be achieved in my country, Tunisia. In Tunisia, the revolution happens for 3 reasons. First, unemployment. Second, social inequalities. And third, political repression. Only political will and national strategies defining priorities in this context will bring social equity and gender equality. By constitution, we have parity and no discrimination of gender. We support equality of gender and participation of women in labor force. But in Tunisia, there is still a gap between women and men to access to the labor market, to access to finance, to entrepreneurship, to private sector. In political arena too, there is only 30% of women in parliament. We did better than US, but it's not enough. Just 3 ministers, women in the government, just an average of 10%. Social inequalities too, we record a disparity between regions in the rate of poverty. Tunisia gets the Nobel Prize Peace 2015. The National Dialogue Quartet between the Human Rights Quartet between the Entrepreneurs National Council, the Labor Force Union, and the lawyers. Only dialogue and participatory process can bring fruitful partnerships. SDGs, 5 Ps, partnership, prosperity. We can achieve the sharing of prosperity and bring in peace. Ladies and gentlemen, there is many ways to design, implement, mentor review mechanism. Whatever approach chosen, the evaluation must enable to access progress. Invest in people and planet. Capacity buildings, empowering women, strengthen participation of women in politics and economy. Budgetizing with gender approach equity. Improve the linkages between all stakeholders, parliament, government, private sector, civil society. Strengthen evaluation capacity to better evaluate, customize it by social, cultural, political, economic contexts for the countries. Ladies and gentlemen, the Global Parliamentarians Forum for Evaluation aim is to advance to the enabling environment for transparent evaluation processes in line with the principle of no one left behind, transparency and accountability at the national level to contribute to good governance and sustainable development. Global Parliamentarians Forum for Evaluation is peoples bringing together to demonstrate how evaluation transforms development results. Parliamentarians are the bridge between politicians and national policy. Evaluation is the tool of efficiency, but not only this, it's also a tool to demonstrate how is the fiction, politician speeches, and national policy. Thank you very much.
we have a few minutes before our coffee break, so let me invite members of the audience to pose questions to our panelists. We're recording this, so it'll be very helpful if you use a microphone, and I see you're being assisted. Our first, please introduce yourself and a short intervention, please.
Yes, I'll try to be short. My name is Veronica McGarr. I'm leading the work at WHO on gender equity and human rights. Thank you very much for a absolutely brilliant panel and providing important leadership in this area. I have a few points that I'd like to make. First one is to consider not to leave the human rights discourse elements out of this. Equity, of course, is a proxy when we do data disaggregation, but we need to do a much better job in measuring things like social participation, accountability, and use the treaty monitoring bodies. So drawing a little bit from what David Navarro says, keep human rights in. A little bit about health inequality monitoring, which is the core of what we do, at least at WHO and in my unit. Collecting, analyzing, reporting is critical. It needs to be a part of the business of what every country does, and we are there to support. It goes beyond the reporting, then, of course, to use the data. A lot of capacity is required, is what we're seeing. Building a little bit on one of the panelists, starting point really needs to be from historically oppressed groups. Identity alone, being a woman, can't explain the inequalities. We need to look at race. We need to look at ethnicity. That is also gender work. My last point is, in addition, I love the intersectionality work, the double stratification. That's the way we call it in statistics. But also drawing on relational theories, relationships with men, our brothers, our fathers, our sons. This is also critical, but it's not enough to stay at the sociocultural level. We also need to look at relationships with institutions, with the state, with corporations. And this is where gender and women's movement has actually been the strongest. And so the whole personal is political. We need to make sure that gender does not become depoliticized concept in our work. Thank you.
Wonderful, not just concise, but very rapid as well. Thank you. Perhaps we can just take one or two more points, and then we can return to our panelists. So over by the wall there, just introduce yourself and your point.
Thank you very much. My name's Helen Dennis. I work for an NGO for Christian Aid based in the UK, and we've been part of a number of conversations amongst civil society groups there about what Leave No One Behind will mean in practice, including for the British government. I was really encouraged by the emphasis on power and rights. I think a number of us are very worried that Leave No One Behind could actually become quite a charitable concept. And actually that notion of empowerment, of rights-based approaches is really important to capture in our evaluation, I think, of how this is implemented. I still have questions, which in some respects were just raised by the lady there, about who actually decides who is furthest behind. How are there going to be particular processes or ways in which governments can actually assess who they will, I suppose, look at in relation to social groups. And at various points within the negotiations, there was also discussion about equity targets. So looking at the targets with an equity lens and looking at the ratio gaps in outcomes, whether that was between, say, the richest and poorest 10%, or you could, however you want to look at income, or between particular social groups. And it felt that kind of dropped off the agenda a little bit. And I think it would be very interesting to get your perspectives on whether or not, as you help build this kind of evaluation framework, that can feed into the national reviews, the political processes that we're going to see starting this year. Thanks.
Thanks very much. One or two points there about metrics, which we'll take forward in the next session after the coffee break. But thanks for those points. I see an arm raised here, please.
Thank you very much. A quick question addressed to Professor Wickramasinghe.
Can you just identify yourself? Thanks.
Yes, my apologies. I'm from the Asian Development Bank. In the evaluation department. You raised a very interesting point about Sri Lanka, and I've been looking at Sri Lanka from a different context, and there's this anomaly where, from a policy perspective, women have got access from primary and secondary education, 60% getting into university are women, but yet there's an issue of the engagement in the workforce. And one of the responses we got when looking at the issue was the fact it's a cultural issue, that women are mothers and they need to stay at home, etc., which then sort of begs the question: are there any other kind of policy interventions that are being missed, or some paradigm that is being missed into understanding why is it that an educated woman is not willing, or is not? The statistics are showing not getting engaged in the workforce.
Great, thanks. A very specific question there. Let's just take a couple more and then we'll turn back to our panelists. I see Professor Schwant.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Schwant. I'm at the University of Illinois, and I'm a member of EVAL SDG. This is for the whole panel. Given this is a technical workshop, I wonder if you all could comment at some point on how we manage the tension between thinking in cases as evaluators, and at the same time dealing with averages, dealing with generalities. We walk a line between those two. I'd be interested in your reflections on those.
Great, thanks. Let's just take one more point, maybe from this side of the room, since I was gazing in that direction. Any points from over here? Yes, I see you here, yeah.
My name is Florence Etta, a member of EVAL SDGs. My question, and thank you for the very interesting presentations this morning. I'm sitting here thinking, and maybe this is not the place for this question, but we say that, I understand, that countries have a major role in determining which of the SDGs they probably would pursue in what order. I may be wrong. But how would these countries determine if the indicators that have been suggested and agreed are sufficient for them or adequate, especially within the frames of the complexities that have been identified this morning? And I'm not sure if my question is clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence. We've had quite a range of different questions from the audience, so I'm going to ask our panelists to pick those questions that particularly resonated with them, or indeed we've had comments as well as questions. So I'm going to start with inviting Dr. Nabarro to begin and then move along the panel.
Can I come down?
You can, by all means. Let me turn then to Professor Wickramasinghe.
I'll take the direct question on Sri Lanka, although I'm not too happy having to give causal explanations. You're very correct, and it is a very good point. We have very high education levels, and that there's a mismatch between education and what you see of women in the workforce. Now, I think we need to unpack that a little further, because if you're talking education, you have right now, the percentages escape me, but around 90% of women and men are educated. But what kind of education is it? Now, certainly, it is an education in the indigenous languages. So when it comes to technical education, when it comes to English, etc., which is increasingly important in today's global world, they do not have the skills. So there is that factor. If you look at the workforce, certainly we are having huge problems as 30% women in the workforce. And even when it was, and the statistics tends to change, and even if you compare that to, say, 1997, something that comes into mind is that if you look at the number of women who were migrant workers who were working in the Middle East and other countries, you would see that at that time it was almost 74% or so. But now if you look at the same statistic, you find that it's about 34%. So there's been a kind of a come down. And in that context, it's also very important for us to keep in mind the fact that there could be indicators which may always be changing. And here, so you have that kind of thing happening as well. Now, your question is why? Why? Well, certainly I agree it is cultural, because we have had reversals taking place due to cultural factors. For instance, take take the migrant women issue. There's been a kind of a backlash on women going abroad. But, on the one hand, of course, they are exposed to abuse, but at the same time, they do gain an element of empowerment. But there's been a cultural, social backlash to women going abroad. There's been, and okay, you have to look at the quality of the education and what people gain. If you look at the universities, you might find that the number of unemployed graduates are mainly women, and governments have not necessarily taken that into consideration in terms of creating employment. But that is one fact that we need to keep in mind from a gender perspective. And of course, the type of employment opportunities available. So I think let's not be monocausal in our analysis, but look at the other possibilities as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we're moving constantly between the specific and the general, aren't we, with evaluation. Let me turn then to Marco Segone, and a few words. I think we just have a few minutes, Marco.
Yeah. No, thanks a lot for the very interesting question and comments. Perhaps just three things. First of all, absolutely yes. SDGs, the concept of no one left behind, and also the equity focus and gender responsive evaluation, they're all based on human rights. I mean, human rights is really the overall framework that is guiding all of this discussion. And that's why, that brings me to the second comment, and that's why we must go beyond the simply disaggregating data. Obviously, disaggregating data is necessary, but definitely is not enough. We should really, as an evaluator, we should look really at the root causes of these inequalities. So we should look at the power relationships, we should look at cultural beliefs, we should look at social norms, and that's part of the complexity of the challenge that we have as evaluation community, and that we are going to talk during the next 2 days here. And this brings me to the third point, that is about the intersectionality. I'm really very happy that you made very strongly the point about, of the importance of not treating any populational group as an homogeneous group. We know that in any population group there are inequalities within that groups, and few of you were asking me why it's called EvalGender Plus. Well, the plus is exactly about the intersectionality. It's exactly acknowledging that also when we are talking about gender, when we are talking about women, we should not treat this group as an homogeneous one, but we should always look at these kind of intersectionalities.
Great. Thank you, Marco. Let me proceed along the panel then and invite the Honourable Olfa Sharif to say a few words. Thanks.
Thank you for interesting questions and comments. I'd like just to have one comment about, for the first question, about collecting, analyzing, and reporting for every country and how it does. It's really very important to collect statistics, and doing good data make good policies. So disaggregating data, having gender approach could help to reduce inequalities in different sectors. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So lots of interest in data, statistics, metrics, all of which we'll pick up in the next session. Let me turn finally then to Dr. Nabarro.
Thank you very much. The only reason why I wanted to come last is I am not an expert, nor am I really a client in the way that our colleagues are. And so this is amateur time now, and I'm going to comment on various little things. Number one, to those of you who are evaluating health work, education work, or work to do with any kind of service, I hope that you will advance the campaign to focus on access and outcomes of contacts between different groups of people and those services, and really hit hard on those who describe their services in terms of supply or provision only. I'm sure you do, but you will be amazed about the number of people working in ministries of health, working in development organizations, working in NGOs and in business, who will describe the gender sensitivity or vulnerability impact of their work in terms of provision rather than in terms of access and outcome. This will be a big focus of the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, because humanitarian action traditionally has been one of the least sophisticated areas of focusing on access and outcome. If you think I'm talking, if you don't get what I'm saying, please talk to me afterwards or some other time, because I think this is a really, really important. It just relates to the comment from our colleague in WHO. Number two, this issue about who decides who is furthest behind and how the degree to which such concepts get politicized in a bad way or in a repressive way is really important, and that's where I believe that you are so critically important as a profession, because of what I talked about before, the evidence policy cycle. Policymakers don't always know the questions they want to ask. They will often engage with people with your expertise. Who do you think we should be focusing on if we're looking at those who may be left behind? And you have a golden opportunity to help them develop their frame of reference. And then they can commission you to do the work. And then you find, well, perhaps you didn't get it quite right. And so you can feed back to them. And it's like Karl Popper's approach to learning, that you develop hypotheses, you test them, and if you find the hypothesis doesn't work, then you modify it. That's what the evidence policy cycle is all about. And we're going to have to get that really whizzing round and round as we move forward with this new agenda. That's why the presentations from others on this panel, for me, have been fascinating. I shall leave this event with my head quite nicely perturbed, because I've heard things that I didn't know before, and that's what this cycle is all about. You can short-circuit it hugely. Often, simply the discourse between an evaluator and a policymaker can be transformative, even before a whole stack of work is done. Thirdly, a comment from yourself, sir, I forgot your name, about the case versus average. I mean, you know, we've got to obviously have both, and what we have to do is to watch out for the tyranny of averages, or even worse, medians, just to make absolutely certain that we are digging at all times to test what lies underneath, and the digging often involves cases. And those of us who work in policy, and certainly politicians, are absolutely focused on that the case often has more power than the average or the median. And then lastly, there's just a little bit of anxiety that I think does crop up, because the whole SDG discourse is so focused on the nation state as being the primary unit of kind of truth and centrality. I think there will be some who say the nation state doesn't always get it right first time, and so there is a need to really focus on the importance of inclusion. And again, the evaluator can say to the policymaker, hang on a bit, where are the indigenous people? Where are the disabled people? Where are the people who are being beaten or being dispossessed? They need to be at the table in the discussion. Thank you. You were going to say something.
Yes, David, sorry to beat you to it, but I do need to kind of reiterate my point, which is, I think linking, I'm sorry, I missed your question when you asked it. I think the average and the case, we both need them both, and I think that was what I was laboring to say, that equity and equality both counts. And when I got back to the table, David said, no, you know, it's equity. And I'm a little disturbed, because it is both, because you're talking then about averages and the case both together. And I think we should definitely move away from either or options when it comes to development analysis and evaluation.
But in our little discussion, we were talking about rebalancing.
Terrific. I think what we're seeing is the start of a discussion that's going to take us through all of today and at least half of tomorrow. I'd like to thank all of our participants. I'm not going to attempt to summarize the very different points which have come up, but I think it's been very interesting that our different panelists have said, although dealing with very different examples and different materials, and coming from different perspectives, there have been lots of common issues. At the same time, there have been lots of contrasts. So I think that's been a very rich discussion that'll take us forward into today. It remains for me to say thank you so much to each and every one of our panelists today, and indeed a big thank you to the audience for your comments and participation. Thank you.